I have spent most of my adult life making sure things did not fall apart. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly and consistently. For more than 3 decades, I worked in operations for a regional healthcare network outside Chicago, the kind of organization people only notice when something goes wrong. My job was to make sure it usually did not. Schedules, staffing, budgets, compliance reviews. The 1,000 small decisions that keep hospitals and clinics running without panic. I was good at it. I was trusted. People came to me when systems were stressed and nobody could quite explain why. At home, everyone thought my life ran just as smoothly. I am Evelyn Carter, 61 years old, married for 24 years, mother of 2 grown children who had recently left the house. From the outside, it looked solid. That word came up a lot. Solid marriage, solid career, solid work. Friends at church used it. Family members used it. Even Richard, my husband, used it when he wanted to reassure someone that everything was fine. I used it too, mostly out of habit. Our house sat on a quiet street lined with mature trees and identical mailboxes. We bought it in the late 90s when the kids were small and the neighborhood was full of young families and strollers. Over the years, the block aged with us. Kids grew up, parents got gray, lawns stayed trimmed because that was what you did. On Sunday mornings, Richard and I would drive to church together, sit in the same pew, nod to the same people, exchange the same polite smiles. People saw us as dependable. They saw longevity and mistook it for intimacy. Inside the house, things were quieter than they used to be. Not tense, not openly unhappy, just hollow in places where noise once lived. The kitchen table still had 4 chairs, but only 2 of us used them now. The hallway outside the kids' rooms stayed dark. Their doors were closed. Not out of anger, but out of absence. Our son had moved to Denver for work. Our daughter had taken a job on the East Coast. The empty nest arrived all at once, not gradually, and the silence that followed felt heavier than I expected. Richard handled it by staying busy. He worked in commercial real estate, always chasing the next listing, the next deal. He left early, came home late, talked about market shifts and interest rates over dinner while scrolling through emails on his phone. I listened the way I always had, asked the right questions, remembered names. He liked that about me. I was steady, predictable, useful. I did not realize how much of my identity had been built around being useful, until there was less to manage at home. At work, my days were full. A new outpatient facility was opening in the spring, and the rollout was complicated. Staffing ratios, vendor contracts, IT integration. I arrived before sunrise most mornings. Coffee in hand, hair pulled back, mind already running through contingencies. Younger colleagues teased me gently about my discipline. I smiled and told them someone had to keep the wheels on. They respected me. That mattered more than I admitted. In the evenings, I came home to a house that no longer needed me in the same way. Dinners were simpler, conversations shorter. Richard would ask about my day in a general sense, and I would answer in the same general way. Fine, busy, nothing unusual. We had been together long enough to skip details without it feeling like neglect, or so I thought. The first real shift did not announce itself. It crept in through small changes. Richard stopped asking me to join him for networking events. He said it was not my scene anymore. He started referring to plans as his plans rather than ours. When I suggested a weekend trip, he hesitated, said his schedule was unpredictable. None of it felt like a crisis. It felt like healing, like the natural thinning out of shared space after decades together. I told myself this was what long marriages look like once the children were gone. We adjusted. We found new rhythms. We did not panic just because things felt different. I had always been good at not panicking. One evening in early fall, I stood alone in the kitchen, rinsing dishes we had barely touched. Richard had eaten quickly and gone upstairs to take a call. I could hear his voice through the ceiling, animated, lighter than it had been with me in a while. I turned off the faucet and listened without meaning to. He laughed. That caught my attention. It had been a long time since I heard him laugh like that at home. I told myself not to read into it. People laugh at work. People have private jokes. Marriage does not mean access to every sound a person makes. Still, something tightened in my chest and did not quite release. Later that night, as we lay in bed facing opposite directions, Richard said we needed to talk soon. Not tonight, he added. but soon. His tone was calm, almost rehearsed. I said okay. My heart began to beat a little faster. I stared at the ceiling and counted my breaths until he fell asleep. The next morning, everything looked the same. Coffee brewed, showers steamed. I drove to work and solved a staffing problem before most people had opened their laptops. I signed off on a vendor contract that saved the department 6 figures over 3 years. People thanked me. They relied on me. I drove home feeling capable and strangely unmoored. That afternoon, I walked through the house and noticed how much of my life was structured around anticipating needs that no longer existed. A stack of mail and tried to name what I was feeling. It was not fear yet, it was awareness. When Richard came home that evening, he did not sit down right away. He hovered near the doorway, hands in his pockets, eyes scanning the room as if looking for the right angle. He said we should sit at the table. I nodded and pulled out a chair. My mind shifted automatically into problem-solving mode. What changed? What variables mattered? What outcomes were possible? He said that things had been changing between us. He said it carefully, like someone choosing words they hoped would not break anything. He said he felt restless. He said he needed space. Not a separation exactly, he added quickly, but time to figure things out. He emphasized that he did not want drama. He wanted to handle this like adults. I listened without interrupting. That is something I learned early in my career. Our children, our reputation in the community. He said that at our age stability mattered, that we should stay connected. Friends, he said. We could stay friends. The word landed oddly, friends, as if it were a compromise, a kindness. I asked what that meant in practical terms. He said we would still show up to family events together, still attend church, still present a united front. Privately, we could take space. He said people did not need to know the details. There was no reason to make things uncomfortable for everyone. I noticed that he said everyone instead of me. I nodded. I did not agree. I did not disagree. I asked a few clarifying questions the way I would in a meeting. He answered them with visible relief, as if my calm response confirmed his belief that this would be easy, that I would be reasonable, that I would not disrupt the system. When the conversation ended, he went upstairs again, leaving me alone at the table. The house felt larger than it ever had. I sat there for a long time after the lights were off, hands folded, listening to the refrigerator hum. That night, I did not sleep much. I was not crying. I was thinking about patterns, about power, about how often I had been the one to smooth transitions for others without asking whether the transition worked for me. By morning, the word solid no longer fit. Something had shifted. Not broken, not exploded, just moved enough that I could finally see the gap. I did not know yet what I would do with that knowledge. I only knew that the life everyone thought was stable had begun to quietly rearrange itself, and I was standing right in the middle of it, waiting to see what would fall next. Over the next few days, I kept moving through my routines as if repetition might anchor me. I woke early, drove the same route to work, parked in the same spot, nodded at the same security guard. My hands knew what to do even when my mind drifted. I noticed how often people asked how I was and how easily I answered fine. The word slipped out without thought, polished by decades of use. Richard acted lighter after that conversation, as if he had unloaded something heavy onto the table and trusted me to carry it. He left notes on the counter about being out late. He sent brief texts about dinner plans changing. There was an ease to his movements that made me feel like the anxious one for noticing. He did not argue. He did not apologize. He behaved like someone who believed the hardest part was already done. One evening, he suggested we take a walk after dinner. The air had turned crisp, the kind that made the leaves sound brittle underfoot. We moved side by side down the street, hands not touching, the distance between us feeling intentional rather than awkward. He talked about a listing that might close soon. He talked about traffic. Then he circled back to us. He said again that he had not left. Not really. He said space did not have to mean separation. He said the kids did not need to be dragged into something unfinished. He said people our age did not start over lightly. He said he hoped I could see the bigger picture. I asked him to explain what he meant by bigger picture. He slowed his pace and turned toward me, face calm, voice measured. He said stability mattered more than emotion at this stage of life. He said comfort was underrated. He said we had built something that deserved protection, even if it needed to change shape. I listened and nodded. The way I had He said I would understand that keeping things smooth was better than tearing them apart. When I asked where that left me, he paused. He said I would still be me. That answer told me everything and nothing at the same time. Back home, he went upstairs, and I stayed in the living room, lights off, watching the reflection of passing cars slide across the ceiling. I thought about how often I had been praised for being easy to work with. I thought about how often that same quality had been used to move decisions past me. At work the following week, a colleague asked if everything was all right at home. She said it casually, eyes kind, voice lowered. I asked what made her ask. She said Richard mentioned we were adjusting to an empty nest and that I was taking it harder than he expected. I thanked her for checking in and returned to my spreadsheet. The cells blurred for a moment before snapping back into focus. That was when I understood that Richard was not just asking for space. He was curating a version of the story that required my cooperation. The invitations started coming differently after that. Dinner parties where I was told last minute that Richard had already said yes for both of us. Church events where people assumed we would arrive together. I declined politely and sent my regards. Richard would call afterward, voice tight, asking why I had not come. He said it put him in an awkward position. He said people noticed. He said it did not have to be this way. I told him I needed time. That was true, though not in the way he thought. One afternoon, he stopped by the house unexpectedly. He walked in like it was still entirely his space, dropped his keys on the counter, leaned back against the sink. He said we should talk logistics. He said friends made better partners than strangers. He said we could still support each other. He said he would hate for things to turn bitter. I asked him if he was worried about me or about how things looked. He frowned slightly, as if the question missed the point. He said those were not separate concerns. He said optics mattered. He said people judged quickly and harshly, especially women. That last part stayed with me. He said staying connected would protect both of us. He said I would not want to be seen as unstable or emotional. He said I had a reputation too. He smiled when he said it, like he was offering helpful advice rather than a warning. I realized then that he believed I would agree, not because it was fair, but because it was easier, because I had always chosen the path of least disruption. After he left, I walked through the house again, slower this time. I noticed how much of the space reflected his preferences, the furniture he chose, the art he liked, the routines he set. I stood in the doorway of the guest room and imagined what it would feel like to reclaim something without asking permission. At work, I stayed late one night, not because I had to, but because the quiet helped me think. The building emptied out around me, lights clicking off floor by floor. I opened a new document and began listing what I knew, what had changed, what I controlled, what I did not. It felt familiar, grounding. This was how I approached any complex problem. You defined the variables before you moved. Richard wanted me present but compliant, visible but silent, connected but contained. I did not tell anyone what I was thinking. Not my sister, not my friends, not my colleagues. I watched, I listened. I paid attention to how people reacted when I stopped filling the space, how quickly assumptions formed in the absence of explanation. One Sunday morning, I went to church alone for the first time in years. I slid into a pew near the back and kept my head down. A few people turned, surprised. One woman squeezed my hand and said she was praying for me. I thanked her. I did not correct whatever story she had already heard. After the service, Richard approached me with a smile that did not reach his eyes. He said it was good to see me. He said people were asking questions. He said we should align our messaging. I told him I was not ready to message anything. He looked at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. He said he hoped I would not make things harder than they needed to be. His voice was calm, but there was an edge underneath it that I recognized from negotiations that were turning. That night, I sat at the kitchen table long after dark, hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had gone cold. I thought about how often women my age were told to be gracious, to take the high road, to keep the peace. I thought about how rarely anyone asked what that piece cost. I did not make any announcements. I did not draw any lines. I simply stopped showing up where my presence was expected without being invited. I let calls go to voicemail. I answered messages hours later instead of immediately. I He asked where I had been. He asked why I was pulling away when he was trying to be reasonable. I did not argue. I did not defend myself. I did not reassure him. What surprised me most was not his frustration, but my own calm. The absence of constant explanation felt strange at first, like stepping into a room without furniture. Then it began to feel spacious. One evening, as I prepared dinner for one, I realized that something had already changed. I was no longer reacting to his expectations. I was observing them. I did not yet know where that would lead, but I could left undefined. It was no longer just between us. It never is. Not when a marriage has been visible for decades. Silence invites interpretation, and interpretation spreads faster than truth. My sister Margaret called one afternoon while I was still at the office. She asked how I was doing, the way people do when they already suspect the answer. I told her I was managing. She said she had heard that Richard and I were going through an adjustment, and that she wanted to make sure I was not isolating myself. I asked what she had heard exactly. She hesitated, then said Richard mentioned we were giving each other space, but staying close for the sake of the family. For the sake of the family. The phrase carried weight, the kind that presses down without ever fully revealing its source. Margaret suggested we meet for coffee. I agreed, mostly because avoiding her would only fuel more concern. We sat across from each other in a quiet place near her house, the kind of cafe that prided itself on being cozy. She leaned forward, hands wrapped around her cup, eyes searching my face for cues. She said she knew how hard transitions could be at our age. She said I had always been strong, and that strength sometimes made people forget to check in. She said she admired how calm I seemed. Then she added that calm could be misread. People might assume I was fine when I was not. I told her I appreciated the concern. I did not tell her what I was thinking, which was that calm had never protected me from being misunderstood. It had only made misunderstandings easier to sustain. She asked if Richard was treating me well. I said that depended on how one defined well. She frowned slightly and said she hoped I was not letting pride get in the way of reconciliation. She reminded me that marriage was work, especially after the children were gone. She said compromise mattered. I realized then that everyone was already negotiating on my behalf. At church the following Sunday, the atmosphere felt different, subtle but unmistakable. People greeted me with longer hugs, quieter voices. A few asked how the kids were, then paused as if waiting for me to say something else. One woman mentioned how much she admired couples who stayed committed through difficult seasons. Another said she believed in forgiveness and fresh starts. No one asked what I wanted. Richard arrived late and took a seat a few rows ahead of me. He turned once and smiled, a practiced expression that conveyed reassurance. I wondered how many people took that smile as confirmation that everything was under control. After the service, he was surrounded by familiar faces. I stood off to the side, nodding politely when someone approached, excusing myself when conversations edged too close to personal. Later that afternoon, he called. He said people were worried. He said my absence from gatherings was being noticed. He said we should be careful not to create unnecessary tension. I asked him what he had told them. He said he had kept it vague, emphasized mutual respect, said we were handling things privately. He asked me to do the same. It struck me that his version of handling things privately involved a great deal of public coordination. The next week brought a family dinner at my sister's house. I considered not going, then decided avoidance would only reinforce the idea that I was unstable. I arrived on time with a bottle of wine and a neutral expression. Richard was already there, laughing with my brother-in-law as if nothing had changed. When he saw me, he stepped forward and kissed my cheek, a gesture that felt more performative than intimate. During dinner, conversation drifted easily until it did not. Someone mentioned how quiet the house must be now that the kids were gone. Another joked about second honeymoons. Richard responded smoothly, said we were adjusting, said it was a different chapter. He glanced at me, waiting for confirmation. I smiled and said change was inevitable. After dessert, Margaret pulled me aside. She said she was glad I came. She said she hoped I was not holding things in. She said families could weather anything if people stayed open. I told her I was open to clarity, not pressure. She looked confused by that distinction. On the drive home, I felt the weight of expectations settling around me like a coat I had worn for too long. Everyone wanted me to smooth the edges, to make this transition palatable. No one seemed interested in whether the transition itself was fair. At work, the dynamics shifted as well. A colleague asked if I needed to take time off. Another mentioned that stress could impact performance. The comments were gentle, well-intentioned, and revealing. Richard had mentioned our situation to someone connected to my professional circle, not details, but enough to plant a narrative. I stayed late again that night, the building quiet except for the hum of air conditioning. I reviewed budgets and staffing plans, then closed my laptop and sat back in my chair. I thought about how quickly a reputation could be shaped by what was said and what was left unsaid. I thought about how often women were advised to manage perceptions rather than confront realities. Richard wanted alignment, family wanted harmony, community wanted reassurance. What I wanted had not yet been part of the conversation. When Richard came by the house again later that week, he spoke as if we were partners managing a shared project. He said we should be consistent. He said mixed signals confuse people. He said staying on the same page would make this easier for everyone. I asked him whose page we were on. He laughed lightly and said ours, of course. Then he added that I had always been good at seeing the bigger picture. He said I was practical, not emotional. He said that was one of the things he respected about me. The words landed like a reminder of the role he expected me to play. He said we could still show up together when it mattered. He said appearances were not about pretending. They were about protecting what we had built. He said it would be selfish to disrupt the family over feelings that might pass. I told him I was not interested in pretending. He said pretending was a harsh way to put it. He said he preferred the word mature. After he left, I sat at the dining table and stared at the wood grain, tracing familiar lines with my eyes. I felt the urge to explain myself rise up, then recede. Explaining would invite debate. Debate would invite pressure. Pressure would push me back into the role of mediator rather than participant. I began to understand that the conflict was not about whether we stayed married or not. It was about who controlled the story in the meantime. Over the next few weeks, I made small, deliberate choices. I attended fewer events. I responded to messages. I stopped being silent because I'm not going to. Some seemed relieved by that answer. Others looked disappointed, as if I had failed to reassure them. Richard grew more insistent. He said my distance was being noticed. He said it made him look like the bad guy. He said I was being unfair by withdrawing when he was trying to be reasonable. I listened. I acknowledged his feelings without agreeing to his terms. I noticed how often he framed his discomfort as my responsibility. One evening he asked if I planned to keep this up. I asked him what he meant by this. He said the silence, the absence, the lack of cooperation. I told him I was not trying to punish him. I was trying to understand what I wanted. He said understanding could wait. He said damage was being done now. That was the moment something settled inside me. I saw clearly that his urgency had nothing to do with reconciliation and everything to do with control. He needed my presence to validate his version of events. Without it, the structure he relied on began to wobble. I did not say any of this out loud. I simply nodded and let the conversation end. Later, alone in the living room, I felt a strange mix of grief and relief. Grief for the life that was dissolving. Relief for the clarity that came with seeing it honestly. I knew then that agreeing to stay friends for the family would cost me something I was no longer willing to give. I did not yet know what form my refusal would take. I only knew that my silence had already started to change the balance, and that whatever came next would not be as smooth as everyone hoped. I did not announce anything. There was no speech, no boundary spelled out in neat sentences, no dramatic declaration that I was done explaining myself. I simply stopped doing it. The choice arrived quietly, almost unnoticed at first, like a light switched off in a room no one was standing in. The first thing I changed was my responsiveness. When my phone buzzed with Richard's name, I let it ring. When messages came through asking where I had been or why I had not replied, I waited. not hours at first, just long enough to remind myself that urgency was no longer mine to carry. I answered when I had something to say, not when someone expected reassurance. It felt strange in my body, like walking with a different posture. For years, my reflex had been to smooth tension before it hardened. Now I let it sit. I told myself discomfort was not the same as danger. At work, I kept my calendar intact. Meetings started on time. Decisions were made. I did not bring my personal life into conference rooms or hallways. If someone asked how things were going, I said I was fine and redirected the conversation. It was not avoidance. It was containment. I chose where my energy went. The first real test came with an invitation I did not decline directly. A longtime friend from church sent a message about a small dinner gathering. She mentioned that Richard would be there. I read the message twice and closed my phone. I did not respond. An hour later, another message arrived. Checking that I had seen the invite, I waited until the next morning and replied that I would not be able to attend. No explanation, no apology. That evening, Richard called. His voice was controlled but tight around the edges. He asked if everything was all right. He said my absence had been noticed. He said it would have been easier if I had told him sooner. I listened until he paused, then said I had other plans. That was all. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument we had ever had. After that, the calls became more frequent. Not angry, not pleading, just persistent. He framed each conversation around concern. Concern for me, concern for the kids, concern for how things might look. I noticed how often he used words like reasonable and mature. I noticed how rarely he asked what I needed. One afternoon, he showed up at the house without warning. I had just come home from work and was standing at the counter sorting mail when I heard his key in the lock. I did not rush to greet him. I finished what I was doing and turned when he entered the kitchen. He said he thought we should talk face to face. He said texts were being misinterpreted. He said distance was creating confusion. I asked him to be specific. He said people were asking questions. He said my silence was feeding speculation. He said he was trying to protect us. I told him I was taking space. He said space did not have to mean disappearance. He said friends did not shut each other out. I said I was not shutting him out. I was stepping back. The distinction seemed to irritate him more than outright refusal would have. He walked through the house as he talked, touching the back of a chair, glancing toward the hallway, as if checking that things were still where he left them. He said this was unnecessary. He said we could handle things together. He said I was making it harder than it needed to be. I felt a familiar urge to explain myself rise up, to reassure him that I was not trying to hurt anyone. I let it pass. Instead, I told him I needed time and that I would reach out when I was ready. He looked at me as if I had spoken in another language. He asked if this was a punishment. I said no. He asked if I was trying to send a message. I said I was trying to hear my own thoughts. He shook his head, frustrated, and said silence could be cruel. I replied that it could also be clarifying. When he left, I locked the door behind him and leaned against it for a moment, breathing slowly until my pulse settled. I was not shaking. I was not crying. I felt grounded in a way I had not felt in months. The reaction from others followed quickly. My sister called again, her tone more urgent. She asked why I was pulling away. She said people were worried. She said Richard seemed upset. I told her I was fine and that I was not discussing details. She said she did not understand why I was being so closed off. I told her I had spent years being open and that I was allowed a season of quiet. At church the following Sunday, I sat alone again. A few people waved from across the aisle. One woman asked if I was okay. I said yes and changed the subject. I could feel eyes on me, curiosity humming beneath polite smiles. I did not fill the silence with explanations. I let it be what it was. That afternoon I took a walk through the neighborhood, hands in my coat pockets, leaves crunching underfoot. Houses passed in a familiar blur. I thought about how much of my life had been shaped by responsiveness, by being available, by being the person others relied on to keep things comfortable. I wondered when comfort had become a substitute for consent. The next week I stopped attending gatherings altogether, not in protest, just by choice. I declined invitations with brief messages. Thank you, but I will pass. I need some time. Each response felt like placing a small stone in a line that marked my boundary. The line grew clearer with each decision. Richard adapted his approach. He sent longer messages, softer ones. He said he missed our talks. He said this did not have to be so formal. He said friends checked in on each other. I replied once, telling him I needed distance and asking him to respect it. After that, I did not engage. What surprised me most was how quickly the noise faded once I stopped feeding it. Without my explanations, conversations stalled. Without my presence, events adjusted. People moved on to other topics. The world did not collapse because I stepped back. It simply recalibrated. At work, a project deadline loomed and I poured myself into it. The focus steadied me. My team performed well. Leadership took notice. In the quiet of my office late one evening, I realized how different this silence felt from the one at home. This silence was chosen. It was productive. It belonged to me. One night, as I sat at the kitchen table eating dinner alone, my phone lit up with a message from Richard asking if we could talk soon. He said things felt unresolved. He said he was concerned about where this was heading. I set the phone face down and finished my meal. The food tasted better than it had in weeks. I was not trying to punish him. I was not trying to teach anyone a lesson. I was trying to stop reacting long enough to see what was real. Without my constant presence, Richard's urgency sharpened. Without my reassurance, other people's assumptions lost traction. The imbalance became visible. As the days passed, I felt a shift inside me. The need to manage everyone else softened. In its place was a growing sense of permission. Permission to not attend. Permission to not answer. Permission to let others sit with their discomfort. One evening, as I prepared for bed, I caught my reflection in the mirror and paused. I looked tired but steady, older, yes, but not diminished. I realized I had not asked myself what I wanted in a long time, not in the context of keeping peace or preserving appearances. Just what I wanted. I turned off the light and lay down, listening to the quiet of the house. The silence no longer felt like absence. It felt like space. Space in which something new could form. If I allowed it, I did not know yet what that would be. I only knew that I had stopped explaining myself, and the world had not ended. Once I stopped explaining myself, the quiet gave me room to notice things I had been too busy smoothing over before. It was not just what Richard was doing. It was how the world responded when I stepped back. The absence of my voice created gaps, and those gaps revealed patterns. At work, the pace picked up in a way that demanded my full attention. A new outpatient center was scheduled to open in the spring, and the transition plan was more complex than leadership initially realized. Staffing shortages, vendor delays, regulatory checks. The kind of layered problem I knew how to untangle. I arrived early, stayed late, and moved through meetings with the familiar clarity that came from years of experience. People deferred to my judgment without hesitation. When I spoke, the room listened. One afternoon, my supervisor asked me to stay behind after a planning meeting. She closed the conference room door and sat across from me, hands folded on the table. She said she wanted to check in. She said she knew I had a lot going on personally, and that she appreciated how steady I had been. Then she said something that caught me off guard. She said there had been a few comments circulating, nothing formal, just concern that I might be distracted. I asked where the concern was coming from. She hesitated, then said it was vague. Someone mentioned they had heard my marriage was under strain. She was quick to add that it had not affected my performance and that leadership trusted me. She said she wanted me to know that my work spoke for itself. I thanked her and told her I was fully committed to my role. That was true. What I did not say was that the concern had likely come from Richard, directly or indirectly. He had always understood how narratives moved through social circles, how easily professional spaces absorbed personal stories. The conversation did not threaten me. It clarified something. Silence alone was not enough. Preparation mattered too. That evening, after dinner, I opened my laptop and reviewed my finances with a level of attention I had not given them in years. Joint accounts, retirement funds, credit cards. I was not looking for wrongdoing. I was mapping reality. Numbers steadied me. They did not carry judgment. They simply told the truth. I scheduled an appointment with an attorney the following week. Her name was Susan Blake, a family law specialist recommended through a legal services program my company offered. The office was downtown, understated, efficient. Susan listened more than she spoke, which I appreciated. She asked practical questions. How long had we been married? Were there joint assets? Had there been any threats or pressure? I answered honestly. She did not push me toward any decision. She explained options, what separation could look like, what divorce would involve, what documentation mattered. She reminded me that knowledge did not obligate action. It simply removed surprise. When I left her office, I felt lighter, not because anything was resolved, but because I understood the terrain. At home, the house began to feel less like a shared space and more like a temporary one. I started noticing small things I wanted to change. The way the living room was arranged, the art on the walls. I did not act on the impulses yet. I let them surface without judgment. Richard noticed the shift in me, even if he could not name it. His messages changed tone again, less concerned, more irritated. He asked why I was being distant. He asked if I was talking to anyone. He asked if I was planning something. I replied once, telling him I was focusing on work and needed space. After that, I did not engage. A few days later, I heard from a mutual acquaintance that Richard had mentioned I seemed overwhelmed and that he was worried about my stress levels. The comment was delivered kindly, almost sympathetically. I thanked her for the concern and said I was doing well. After the call ended, I sat quietly and considered how easily concern could be weaponized. I began to keep notes, nothing elaborate, just dates, comments, small observations, who said what. When narratives shifted, it was not paranoia, it was pattern recognition, something I had relied on my entire career. At work, the outpatient project hit a snag when a vendor failed to deliver equipment on time. I stepped in, rerouted resources, negotiated a temporary solution. The opening stayed on track. Leadership praised the team publicly and singled out my role privately. A few weeks later, my supervisor told me they were recommending a compensation adjustment at the end of the year, along with a bonus tied to the project's success. I nodded and thanked her, feeling a quiet sense of satisfaction. Not pride exactly, assurance. At home, the phone rang one evening while I was reading in the living room. It was Richard. I let it go to voicemail. He called again 10 minutes later. I did not answer. When I checked the messages later, his voice sounded strained. He said we needed to talk. He said things were getting complicated. He said he did not understand why I was shutting him out. I set the phone down and returned to my book. For the first time, I did not feel compelled to respond. The next day, my sister called again. She said Richard had reached out to her, worried. She asked if I was all right. I told her I was. She asked if I was being stubborn. I told her I was being deliberate. The distinction did not land well. She sighed and said she hoped I was not making a mistake. After the call, I sat at my desk and stared at the computer screen. I thought about how often women were warned about mistakes that involved choosing themselves, how rarely men were cautioned about the same. The quiet continued. Weeks passed without confrontation, without resolution, without my usual role as mediator. The absence of immediate drama felt unsettling to those around me. To me, it felt instructive. One evening, as I prepared for bed, I realized I had not checked Richard's messages in days. The realization did not bring guilt. It brought relief. I understood then that what I was doing was not withdrawal. It was preparation. I was gathering information, securing my footing, letting others reveal themselves without interference. I lay down that night feeling tired but clear. The silence I had created was not empty. It was working. It became clear soon after that silence does not stay neutral for long. When one person stops shaping the narrative, the story does not disappear. It starts to bend under its own weight. I noticed it first in small ways. A friend I had not spoken to in months sent a message asking if everything was all right. A colleague from a neighboring department mentioned in passing that Richard seemed stressed lately. Nothing direct, nothing confrontational, just enough to tell me that conversations were happening without me in the room. Richard had been very comfortable when he believed I would eventually step back in and smooth things over. Once it became obvious that I was not doing that, his composure began to slip. He started reaching out to people more often. Mutual friends, church acquaintances, even someone who worked tangentially with my healthcare network. He framed everything as concern. Concern for me, concern for how things might look if we handled this poorly, concern for stability, The problem with concern is that it leaves fingerprints. One afternoon, I received an email from a woman named Karen, who had known us socially for years. She worked in insurance and occasionally crossed paths with Richard professionally. The subject line was simple, checking in. She wrote that she hoped I was well and that she wanted to clarify something because she felt uncomfortable being in the middle. She explained that Richard had mentioned I was having a difficult time emotionally and that he was worried I might withdraw from responsibilities. He had asked her advice on how to support me while keeping things professional. She said she wanted me to know what had been said and that she did not share his concerns. I read the email twice, then a third time. There it was, not cruelty, not rage, just a subtle repositioning of me as fragile, unreliable, in need of management. I thanked her for telling me and closed my laptop. I did not respond to Richard. I did not confront him. I added the email to my notes and kept moving. A few days later, something similar happened again. This time, it was an old friend from church who forwarded me a message she had received from Richard. She apologized before sending it, said she felt strange reading it and even stranger not saying anything. The message was longer, more personal. Richard described our situation as amicable but difficult. He said I was taking space in a way that worried him. He said he was trying to be patient and supportive, but that I was shutting down. He said he hoped people would understand that he was doing his best. He never said my name directly. He did not have to. Reading it, I felt a flicker of anger, then something steadier beneath it. Recognition. This was the pattern I had been watching for, the point where the mask did not crack dramatically, but slid just enough to reveal what was underneath. At work, the ripple reached closer. A senior administrator stopped by my office under the pretense of discussing timelines. As we wrapped up, she asked gently if I was holding it yet. She said she had heard things were complicated at home. She said it must be a lot to carry. I met her eyes and said I appreciated the concern. I said my work was steady and that I was fully engaged. I said if there were any questions about my performance, I was happy to address them directly. She smiled and said, "Of course." She said my reputation spoke for itself. She left a moment later, and I sat back in my chair feeling a mixture of frustration and resolve. Richard was no longer waiting for my cooperation. He was trying to work around my absence. That evening he called again. I answered this time, not out of obligation but curiosity. His voice was warm at first, almost relieved. He said he was glad I picked up. He said he felt like things were getting misunderstood. He said people were confused and he hated that. I asked him what exactly he had been telling people. He hesitated, then said he was just being honest. He said he told them I was overwhelmed and needed space. He said he wanted them to be patient with me. I told him that framing me as overwhelmed was not honest. It was convenient. He bristled. He said I was being sensitive. He said he was trying to protect me. He said I should be grateful he was handling things with care instead of letting rumors spiral. I told him that rumors were already spiraling and that his version of care involved speaking for me. There was a pause on the line, longer than before. When he spoke again, his tone had changed. Less soothing, more clipped. He said he did not understand why I was making this adversarial. He said I was creating distance when he was trying to stay connected. He said people were starting to ask questions about my behavior, not his. That was the moment I felt the balance tip. I told him I was not interested in managing perceptions anymore. I told him I was taking time to decide what I wanted, and that I would not be coordinating a public narrative to make him comfortable. I told him I needed him to stop discussing me with others. He laughed softly, not amused, more incredulous. He said that was unrealistic. He said people talk. He said I could not expect him to control that. He said my withdrawal was forcing his hand. I told him that was his interpretation, not my responsibility. Then I ended the call. My hands were steady when I set the phone down. My chest felt tight but clear. The conversation had confirmed what I already knew. He did not want resolution. He wanted access. Over the next week, more messages reached me indirectly. Nothing dramatic, just pieces. A comment here, a forwarded note there. Each one painted the same picture. Richard as the calm center. Me as the unpredictable variable. What he did not realize was that the inconsistencies were beginning to show. In one message, he said I needed space. In another, he said I was refusing to communicate. In one place, he said we were amicable. In another, he hinted that things were strained because of my mood. The story shifted depending on the audience. People noticed. A mutual friend called and asked outright what was going on. She said she had heard 3 different versions and none of them quite lined up. I told her I was taking time for myself and that I was not discussing details. She paused, then said she appreciated my honesty. At church, the questions became more direct. Someone asked if Richard was okay. Someone else asked if I was planning to step back from responsibilities. I answered calmly and briefly. I said I was fine. I said I was choosing quiet. I could feel the atmosphere changing. Where there had been certainty, there was now doubt, not about me, about the story itself. Richard felt it too. His messages grew sharper. He accused me of letting things get out of hand. He said my silence was making him look bad. He said he did not deserve that after everything he had done to be fair. I did not respond. Instead, I met with Susan again. I showed her the emails that had been forwarded to me. I showed her my notes. She read carefully, nodding now and then. She said this was useful. She said not because it proved wrongdoing, but because it showed a pattern of narrative control. She reminded me that clarity was power, that documentation mattered, that I did not have to act yet. When I left her office, I walked a few blocks before heading to the train. The city felt busy and indifferent around me. People moving with purpose, unaware of my internal recalibration. I felt oddly grounded, not victorious, just prepared. That night I sat at the kitchen table again, but the feeling was different. The quiet was no longer just working, it was revealing. Without my participation, Richard's version of events could not stabilize. It shifted, contradicted itself, and slowly lost credibility. I realized then that this was not about exposing him. It was about letting the truth surface on its own. I did not need to argue. I did not need to defend myself. I just needed to stay still long enough for the structure he relied on to show its cracks. As I turned off the lights and headed upstairs, my phone buzzed with another message from Richard asking if we could talk and clear the air. I did not read it. I placed the phone face down on the nightstand and lay back, listening to the house settle around me. For the first time, I was not wondering how to fix this. I was watching it unfold. The moment my family decided it was time to intervene. Arrived without warning, but not without preparation. They did not call it an intervention. Of course, they called it concern, the same word Richard had been using for weeks. Concern sounds gentle. It gives people permission to cross lines while convincing themselves they are helping. Margaret called on a Thursday evening while I was finishing dinner. She said she wanted to stop by the next day. I asked what for. She said she just wanted to talk. Her voice carried that careful tone she used when she had already chosen a side but did not want to admit it. I said she could come by after work. When she arrived, she brought muffins from a bakery we both loved. A peace offering wrapped in paper. She hugged me tightly, held on a second too long, then stepped back and studied my face as if looking for damage. We sat at the kitchen table. She slid the muffins between us and folded her hands. She said everyone was worried. She said Richard seemed exhausted and confused. She said the kids had noticed the tension. She said I had gone quiet in a way that felt alarming. She said she knew I was strong, but strength could turn into stubbornness if I was not careful. I listened, letting her finish. Years ago, I would have interrupted to reassure her, to soften her fear. I did not do that now. She asked if I was angry with Richard. I said anger was not the right word. She asked if I was planning to leave him. I said I was planning to understand what staying would actually mean. She sighed and said that was not a satisfying answer. She reminded me how long Richard and I had been together. She talked about shared history, shared sacrifices. She said marriages did not survive by people pulling away when things got uncomfortable. She said family mattered more than pride. I asked her why everyone assumed this was about pride. She looked surprised by the question. She said she did not know what else to call it. I told her it was about agency. That word landed heavily between us. She said agency was important, but so was grace. She said people our age did not get the luxury of impulsive decisions. She said the world was not kind to women who disrupted stability. She said she did not want to see me isolated. I took a breath and told her something I had not said out loud yet. I told her that staying silent to protect everyone else had already isolated me. That being present only on terms that erased me was not connection, that it was a performance. Margaret leaned back in her chair, lips pressed together. She said she had not thought of it that way. Then she said that maybe I was overthinking things. She said Richard was trying to be reasonable. That word again? I asked her if she had noticed that all the pressure to be reasonable was coming from one direction. She frowned and said she was just trying to help. I told her I knew that. I also told her that helping did not mean deciding for me. The conversation ended politely but unresolved. She hugged me again before leaving, told me she loved me, told me she hoped I would not regret whatever I was doing. When the door closed behind her, I stood in the kitchen and felt the familiar pull to second-guess myself. I let it pass. The next wave came from the children, gently at first. My daughter called from the East Coast, voice cautious. She asked if everything was okay with me and her father. She said he seemed worried. I told her I was fine. She said fine did not sound convincing. I chose my words carefully. I told her her father and I were navigating some changes. I told her I loved her and that she did not need to fix anything. She said she just wanted us both to be happy. I told her happiness was not always loud or immediate. Sometimes it looked like space. She did not argue. She did not fully understand either. A few days later, Richard asked if we could all talk together, as a family. He said it would help clear the air. He said misunderstandings were building. He said he felt like he was losing control of the situation. I told him no, not now. He asked why. I said because group conversations have a way of pressuring the quietest person to give in first. He did not like that answer. He came by the house again the following weekend. This time, he did not pretend it was casual. He stood in the doorway, arms crossed, jaw tight. He said my distance was turning people against him. He said I was letting assumptions spread. He said I owed it to him to correct the narrative. I told him I did not owe him narrative management. He said after everything we had built together, that was a cruel thing to say. I told him cruelty was asking me to show up and smile while he spoke for me behind my back. He looked genuinely shocked, as if the idea had never occurred to him that his version of events was not neutral. He said he had only shared what he thought people needed to know. He said I was being dramatic. That word landed differently than the others. It was sharper, dismissive. I told him I was done participating in conversations that framed my boundaries as instability. I told him I would not be showing up to events for appearances. I told him I was not interested in staying friends for the sake of family optics. He asked what that meant exactly. I told him it meant I was choosing myself. He laughed, not kindly. He said that sounded selfish. He said families did not survive on selfishness. I told him families also did not survive on control. There it was. The truth spoken plainly. No raised voices, no tears. Just a line drawn without apology. He left shortly after, angry but restrained. I watched him drive away from the window and felt a strange calm settle over me. Not relief, certainty. In the days that followed, the pressure increased briefly, then shifted. Margaret sent a message saying she hoped I was okay. I replied that I was. No further explanation. My daughter checked in again, this time less anxious. My son sent a short text saying he loved me. I held on to that. At church, I felt the change. People stopped assuming I would attend with Richard. A few stopped asking questions altogether. Others asked directly what was happening. I told them I was taking care of myself. Some nodded. Some looked uncomfortable. I let both reactions stand. What surprised me most was how quickly the narrative lost momentum once I stopped feeding it. Without my cooperation, it could not stay smooth. Without my presence, it had to adapt. Richard did not adapt well. He sent a message one night saying he felt like I was punishing him. I did not respond. He sent another saying he did not recognize me anymore. I did not respond to that either. The urgency in his tone was no longer about reconciliation. It was about access. I met with Susan again and told her about the family pressure, the conversations, the shift in tone. She listened and said this was often the most difficult phase, the point where people realized quiet was not temporary. She said staying consistent mattered more than explaining. When I left her office, I walked home instead of taking the train. The air was cool, the city steady around me. I felt tired but grounded. That night I sat alone in the living room, lights low, listening to the familiar sounds of the house. I thought about the woman I had been for most of my life, reliable, agreeable, strong in ways that served everyone else first. I realized I was becoming someone else. Not louder, not harsher, just more solid in a different way. As I turned off the lamp and headed upstairs, my phone buzzed with another message from Richard. I did not read it. I placed the phone on the dresser and went to bed, aware that the next phase would not be quiet for long. The shift did not arrive with an explosion. It came quietly, the way consequences often do when they are no longer being managed by someone else. Without my presence smoothing edges and correcting misunderstandings, the space around Richard began to change on its own. I heard about it indirectly at first. A woman from church mentioned that a committee meeting had been postponed because Richard had stepped down from a leadership role he had held for years. She said it casually, almost apologetically, as if she were sharing weather news. I nodded and said I hoped everything was all right. She hesitated, then said she was not sure. She said things felt unsettled lately. A few days later, a mutual friend called and asked if I had heard that one of Richard's real estate deals had fallen through. She said the buyer backed out unexpectedly. She said it had something to do with timing and trust. I told her I had not heard. She paused, then said she hoped he was handling it okay. Each piece arrived without commentary. No one framed it as karma. No one said he deserved it. They simply noted the changes, the way people do when a familiar pattern starts to shift. Richard noticed them too. His messages changed again, less accusatory, more strained. He said things were complicated. He said he felt like everything was happening at once. He said he could use some support. I did not respond. At work, I stayed focused. The outpatient center opened on schedule. The team celebrated quietly. Leadership thanked me publicly, then pulled me aside privately to discuss future projects. There was talk of expanding my role, of succession planning, of trust. I listened and asked thoughtful questions, feeling steady in a way that surprised me. Outside of work, I simplified my life. I stopped attending events out of obligation. I spent evenings reading, walking, cooking meals I actually enjoyed. I rearranged the living room furniture one afternoon, moving a chair closer to the window, opening the space. It felt symbolic, though I did not dwell on it. Richard called one evening after weeks of silence. I almost did not answer. Curiosity won out. His voice sounded tired, not angry, not controlled, tired. He said he did not know who else to talk to. He said things were spiraling. He said people were misinterpreting his intentions. He said he felt alone. I listened without interrupting. When he paused, I asked him what he wanted from me. He hesitated, then said he wanted understanding. He said he wanted reassurance that I was not trying to turn people against him. I told him calmly that I was not turning anyone against him. I was simply not participating in managing his image. There was a long silence on the line. Then he said that felt harsh. I said it felt honest. He asked if I had heard about the deal that fell through. I said no. He explained it anyway, too quickly, as if hoping I would step back into the role of confidant. He said stress was building. He said he was not sleeping well. He said he missed how things used to be. I told him I understood stress. I told him I hoped he took care of himself. I did not offer advice. I did not offer comfort beyond that. The conversation ended awkwardly, unresolved. Afterward, I sat in the quiet living room and reflected on how different this felt from past conversations. There was no pull to fix anything, no urge to soften his disappointment. I felt sympathy without responsibility. That distinction mattered. Over the next few weeks, the ripple spread. Richard's name came up less often in conversations. When it did, the tone had changed. Where there had once been certainty and admiration, there was now hesitation. People spoke carefully. They asked questions instead of making assumptions. At church, I noticed that people no longer expected me to explain his absence or behavior. They stopped asking how we were doing together. They asked how I was doing. The difference was subtle but profound. One Sunday after the service, a woman I barely knew stopped me near the door. She said she admired how I had handled things. I asked what she meant. She said she had watched me choose quiet instead of spectacle. She said that took strength. I thanked her and moved on, feeling a warmth I had not expected. Richard did not experience the shift as quietly. He sent a message one night saying he felt like he was being punished for trying to be reasonable. He said the fallout was unfair. He said I had more power than I realized, and that I was using it against him. I did not respond. Instead, I met with Susan again and told her about the changes. She listened and nodded. She said this was often the point where people realized that silence could not be undone. She said once narratives begin to collapse under their own contradictions, they rarely recover. She asked if I felt ready to make any decisions. I told her I was not ready. At home, I felt not but because I was no longer bracing myself for someone else's reactions. I slept better. I woke up without dread. I moved through my days with intention instead of anticipation. One evening, as I watered the plants by the window, my phone buzzed with a text from Richard. He said he did not recognize his life anymore. He said things were unraveling. He said he wished I would talk to him like before. I set the phone down and finished watering the plants. It occurred to me then that karma was not a dramatic force. It did not arrive with thunder or speeches. It arrived as a series of small imbalances that could no longer be corrected once the person doing the correcting stepped away. Richard had relied on my steadiness to stabilize his world. Without it, the flaws he had ignored became visible. The deals that depended on trust faltered. The social roles that depended on consistency weakened. The narrative that depended on my cooperation fractured. I did not feel joy watching it happen. I felt clarity. As autumn deepened, the days grew shorter. I spent evenings wrapped in a blanket, tea in hand, watching the light fade through the window. The quiet felt earned now, not defensive, not provisional. I knew Richard was struggling. I knew he was reaching out to others, trying to regain footing. I also knew that stepping back in would not help him find it. It would only restore the illusion that had brought us here. One night, my sister sent a brief message asking if I was okay. I replied that I was. She sent back a heart emoji, nothing more. I realized that I no longer felt the need to justify my choices to anyone. Whatever came next would require a different kind of strength. Not silence alone, but action. I was not there yet, but I could feel the pause before the next movement, the moment when stillness gathers enough weight to tip into change. The stillness did not last forever. It rarely does when someone realizes they have lost access they once took for granted. The first sign was a message that did not ask how I was doing or pretend concern. It asked if we could talk. No explanation, no softening language, just urgency. I read it once and did not reply. An hour later, another message came through. This one longer. Richard said he was struggling. He said he felt cut off. He said he needed clarity. He said we could not leave things unresolved like this. I placed the phone face down and went back to what I was doing. That evening, as the sky darkened outside the living room window, I heard a car pull into the driveway. I did not rush to the window. I already knew who it would be. The doorbell rang once. Then again, I stayed seated, heart steady, listening to the sound echo through the house. A knock followed, firmer this time. I stood slowly and walked to the door, not to open it, but to stand behind it and breathe. Richard called my name through the door. He said he just wanted to talk. He said he was not here to argue. He said things had gone too far and we needed to reset. I opened the door part way, enough to see him, but not enough to invite him in. He looked different, less composed. His jacket wrinkled, his eyes tired. He tried to smile and failed. He said he was glad I opened the door. He said he had been worried. He said he needed 5 minutes. I told him now was not a good time. He said there was never a good time anymore. He stepped forward slightly, testing the boundary. I told him to leave, calmly, clearly. He laughed, short and incredulous. He said he was not some stranger. He said this was still his house too. I told him it was not like that, not anymore. His expression shifted then, frustration bleeding through. He said I was being unreasonable. He said I was overreacting. He said he had tried to handle things like an adult, and I had forced his hand. I felt the familiar urge to explain myself rise up. I let it pass. I repeated that he needed to leave. He asked what I was so afraid of. He said I was hiding behind silence. He said if I would just talk to him, things could go back to how they were. I told him quietly that how they were no longer worked for me. He shook his head and said I was making a mistake. He said I would regret pushing him away. He said I did not understand what I was losing. I realized then that this was not about reconciliation. It was about control, about restoring a dynamic where he could speak and I would adjust. I told him again to leave. This time my voice was firmer. He did not move. The air between us felt charged but contained. I was aware of my breathing, slow and deliberate. I was aware of how steady my hands were. I was also aware that he was testing whether I would follow through. I reached into my pocket and took out my phone. I told him I would call the police if he did not leave. He scoffed, said I was being dramatic. He said neighbors would see. He said this would look bad. I said I was done worrying about how things looked. When I dialed, his expression changed. Not anger, alarm. He stepped back a half step but did not turn away. I spoke clearly when the dispatcher answered, giving my address, explaining that my former partner was refusing to leave my property. Richard stared at me as if he did not recognize me. He said I did not have to do this. He said we could talk inside. I told the dispatcher he was still there. Within minutes, red and blue lights washed across the front of the house. The sound of sirens was distant but unmistakable. Richard ran a hand through his hair, pacing now, muttering that this was ridiculous. 2 officers approached calmly. They asked what was going on. I explained. Simply, he interrupted, saying this was a misunderstanding, that we were married. I corrected him. I said we were not living together and that I had asked him to leave. The officers asked him if he lived there. He hesitated. He said not currently. They asked if I had invited him inside. He said no, Hug. They told him he needed to leave. He protested, voice rising, saying this was unnecessary, that I was blowing things out of proportion. One of the officers asked him again, more firmly, to step away from the door. He looked at me then, eyes wide, searching for some sign that I would intervene, that I would smooth this too. I did not. Eventually he backed down, muttering under his breath as he walked to his car. The officers waited until he drove away, then asked if I was all right. I said I was. They reminded me I could call again if he returned. I thanked them. When the lights disappeared down the street, the house felt suddenly very quiet. Not tense, not heavy, just still. I locked the door and leaned against it, letting my head rest against the wood for a moment. My heart was beating faster now, the adrenaline catching up. I breathed through it, counting until the feeling passed. Later that night, my phone buzzed with messages from Richard. Angry, accusatory, then pleading, then silent. I did not respond to any of them. The next morning, I met Susan at her office. I told her what had happened. She listened carefully, nodding. She said this was an important moment, not because of the police, but because I had enforced a boundary without apology. She said that mattered. She asked how I felt. I told her the truth. I felt shaken, but not unsure. At work that day, I moved through my responsibilities with focus. No one mentioned anything. The world did not tilt because of what had happened. That realization grounded me further. In the days that followed, word reached me that Richard was telling people I had overreacted, that I had embarrassed him, that he did not know what had gotten into me. The comments no longer stung. They felt predictable. What surprised me was how many people did not engage with his version. Some said nothing. Some changed the subject. A few checked in on me privately. The difference was subtle but meaningful. One evening, as I sat alone in the living room, lights low, I reflected on how far things had shifted. The man who once believed he could always talk his way back into my space had finally encountered a closed door that stayed closed. I did not feel triumphant. I felt resolved. I knew this was not the end. There were still decisions ahead, conversations that could not be avoided forever, legal steps that would require action rather than silence. But as I turned off the lights and headed upstairs, I felt something I had not felt in a long time. Confidence in my own follow-through. Whatever came next would not be negotiated at my expense. I had proven that to myself. And that knowledge settled in quietly, waiting for the next step. The days after that night settled into a different kind of quiet, one that felt earned rather than imposed. I woke up each morning without the familiar knot in my stomach, without checking my phone for messages I needed to manage. The house still held echoes of a life that had changed, but those echoes no longer felt threatening. They felt like reminders of something finished. I met Susan again the following week and told her I was ready, not rushed, not angry, just clear. We talked through the steps, what separation would look like on paper, what divorce would mean legally and financially, She laid everything out in practical terms: timelines, documents, options. I listened, asked questions, took notes. There was no drama in the room, only decisions. That felt right. At work, the rhythm continued. The outpatient center was running smoothly. Leadership asked me to take on a mentoring role for younger managers. I said yes. I found that guiding others through complexity came more easily now that I was no longer carrying someone else's chaos at home. My focus was sharper, my patience deeper. Richard tried to reach out a few more times. The messages followed a familiar pattern: regret mixed with resentment. Apologies that circled back to blame. I did not engage. Eventually, the messages stopped. The silence that followed did not feel like a standoff. It felt like acceptance. The legal process unfolded without spectacle. Papers filed, accounts separated, logistics handled. There were moments of sadness. Of course. 24 years does not dissolve without leaving marks. But the sadness did not derail me. It moved through me and passed, the way honest emotions do when they are not resisted. I sold the house in the spring, walking through it one last time. I touched the walls, the banister, the kitchen counter worn smooth by years of use. I felt gratitude more than grief. Gratitude for what had been real. Gratitude for what I no longer had to pretend was still working. I moved into a smaller condo closer to the city, light-filled and quiet. The first night there, I sat on the balcony with a cup of tea and watched the skyline glow as dusk settled in. The space felt like mine in a way the old house no longer had. Not because it was perfect, but because it was honest. Friends adjusted. Some drifted away, others stepped closer. My children adapted more easily than I had feared. They asked questions, then respected my answers. They saw me not as someone who had failed to keep a marriage intact, but as someone who had chosen herself with intention. That mattered more than approval. Richard and I spoke once more, briefly, to finalize details. The conversation was civil, distant. There was no attempt to revisit the past. No request to stay friends for the sake of appearances. That chapter had closed. Looking back, I understand now that the most powerful choice I made was not confrontation. It was withdrawal. I stopped explaining. I stopped managing. I stopped cushioning the consequences of someone else's behavior. In that space, the truth did what it always does when left alone. It surfaced. Silence was not passive. It was active. It required restraint, clarity, and trust in my own judgment. It forced others to confront what they had been leaning on without acknowledging. It forced me to confront who I was without the roles I had been playing. If there is one thing I want to leave you with, it is this: you are allowed to speak. You are allowed to choose quietly. Especially later in life, when people expect you to settle, to smooth, to endure. Sometimes the most decisive move is simply no contact, and letting karma speak for itself. If this story resonated with you, if you have ever felt pressured to stay small or silent to keep the peace, I would love to hear your thoughts, share your experience, or let me know what choosing yourself looked like for you. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories about boundaries, resilience, and starting over with intention, stay tuned.